And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We're inside a really fascinating case in Wichita, Kansas. Yesenia Sesmas is on trial for the murder of a mom and the abduction, the kidnapping of a 6-day-old baby. Right now, we have Sergeant Robert Miller of the Wichita Police Department. He's on the stand, and he searched the apartment and is going through some of what he found. Of course, he was looking for that 6-day-old baby, and he found a phone in the apartment, an iPhone. And that iPhone was really critical to this case because it ended up linking police to Yesenia, and they were then able to find her in Texas, locate her with that 6-day-old child, who was a little older by the time they found her, but not much. And they were able to rescue that baby. Now, it looks like they're fumbling through some paperwork right now to admit into evidence. Again, Robert Miller with the Wichita Police is on the stand. I have Gary. Oh, you know what? It looks like, is someone else taking the stand now? It's not 100% clear what's happening, but another woman has now approached the witness stand. I have Gary Gerstenfield, a criminal defense attorney, on the phone with me. Gary, really quickly, because it does look like they're swearing in another witness. What do you make of this case so far?
Hey, Rachel, it's good to be with you, and of course to be with everybody listening in and watching on television. This is a very interesting case. Yesenia, clearly, I think the evidence is stacked against her insofar as the murder, the abduction, and the horror of this crime. It's a matter of really the prosecution just taking their time, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and that's what we're seeing, particularly with the last testimony of the Wichita police officer, Miller. He is explaining that, for example, there was no gun recovered, and the purpose for that is not to prove, of course, that Laura died, but rather to show that this was a homicide and not a suicide. And that's just a matter of part of the dotting the I's and crossing the T's that they have to do in any murder trial.
Okay, Gary, and you know what? You're going to stick with us as we analyze this case. It looks like we now have a new witness on the stand. I didn't catch your name. Let's take a quick listen in. Okay, that's a critical witness in this case, Lacey Webb, and what she just did was identify the defendant, Yesenia Sesmas, as the person that she saw that day of the murder, the day of the disappearance, when she was at her apartment and she saw someone through the crack of the door. She said it was Yesenia. Now, Yesenia is on trial for the murder of a mother and the abduction of that mother's 6-day-old child. Gary Gerstenfield is on the line with me. How critical is that identification, Gary?
Well, it's good to be with you again, Rachel, and the answer is it depends. Certainly, it does help move the ball along, and that now we have an individual who can identify that in fact, that we actually have Yesenia in the apartment. The problem is that this particular witness, Lacey, is not a strong witness. She's got a lot of personal issues in her life, and her vantage point was to the crack of a door, which is not a strong identification. She said that there was some sort of glare between her and Yesenia. I think that's more for emotional impact. I think she's perhaps caught up in the moment of being in trial and being a witness in the case. I think cross-examination would be, how can you recall seeing this person through the crack of the door after this much time? And why, if you were concerned, did you not open the door to investigate further? So her testimony does move the ball along because it at least puts a woman, perhaps Yesenia, but it does put a woman in the crime scene and that helps the case. But is she a strong witness? Not terribly strong. Certainly you couldn't make a case if she was the only evidence they have. They have so much other compelling evidence that this just, as I said, moves the ball along a little further.
Right, but you know, I can imagine some of those very same questions that you're asking probably during cross-exam is what the defense attorney is going to ask this witness. Okay, it looks like the prosecutor is continuing questioning her. This is Lacey Webb, a neighbor of the victim. She apparently saw a woman at the door on the day that the victim was murdered and her baby was kidnapped. Let's take a listen. All right, we're inside the Yesenia Sesmas trial, and a witness is on the stand talking about seeing the defendant on the day of the alleged murder and kidnapping. Yesenia is charged with first-degree murder for killing a mom and then kidnapping a 6-day-old baby from her house. The motive? According to prosecutors, to steal that baby. She was pregnant, had had a miscarriage, wanted her own child. So according to prosecutors, she just stole someone else's. Now, we have this witness on the stand, Lacey Webb. Gary, like you predicted, she's not a very credible witness because we just heard her that she is actually on probation right now. You called it.
Well, unfortunately, you know, prosecutors don't get to choose the witnesses in a case, particularly fact witnesses. They are who they are. And what you're seeing in this case is something that's a very sad reality, and that is poverty and crime, unfortunately, go together. And what we're seeing here is a perfect example. So Laura is killed by this woman. Her child is abducted. Poor Sophia is taken from her mother. Her mother is murdered. And this witness is now, you know, connecting the dots, as I said, moving the case along, showing that the person accused was the person that actually committed the murder. But again, there'll be so much additional evidence, including this one witness, that this only helps move the case further along. But the interesting thing as we watch this case unfold and we listen to more of the witnesses talk, we're going to see how poverty and crime tend to run together. And it's very unfortunate to see that as this unfolds.
Okay, so again, this is Lacey Webb. She's a witness for the prosecution. I guess the point, of course, of her testimony is to ID the defendant, Yesenia Sesmas, as being there on the day of the murder and the kidnapping. This is really just one of those cases that's so horrific, hard to listen to, but definitely interesting. We're going to take a quick break and be back very shortly. A lot here on Law and Crime, including we are going to take you live back inside the Yesenia Sesmas case when they're back from lunch. We just had a very interesting morning of testimony in that case. That is the case of the woman who is facing first-degree murder charges and kidnapping. She allegedly went over to this acquaintance's of hers house and shot the mother, and then this mom had just given birth to a 6-day-old baby, stole the baby, and then tried to flee. She was in Texas when police investigators caught up with her. I'm here with Gary Gerstenfield. We've been monitoring this trial together. He's via Skype. Gary, one of the things that came out during testimony yesterday, and of course we saw some of that in the crime stories we just saw, was body cam footage. All these cops everywhere are all wearing body cameras. And I believe we have some of that we can play just in a second. But how critical is that when you have these jurors actually seeing it firsthand from an officer who's arriving at the scene? The video we saw yesterday, you could actually see this woman sitting on the couch. You could tell there was no struggle. She was just kind of sitting there slumped over, had been shot. It's very effective.
Absolutely, Rachel. You know, when you have one of the problems, I think, in any type of trial is trying to bring factually what happened to life. I say that when we're talking about a homicide in a very sad case, but still, you're trying to bring the events as they occurred to life so the jury can really get into the story. What prosecutors' jobs is to tell a story. This story is a murder. It involves abduction, a kidnapping of a brand new 6-day-old child, then leaving the state, going to Texas, and then the trail that was left behind, and that trail ultimately led to the capture of Yesenia, and ultimately now what we have is the trial. But now what we have to do is we have to go back to that jury, and we have to say, this is what happened, and this is what the police saw. And rather than having the police officers come in and have to describe...
And I just want to warn our viewers, I'm sorry to cut you off, Gary. This is actually the camera footage, the body camera footage from one of the officers, and it does, you know, it gets a little bit graphic, so I do want to warn our viewers of that. But go ahead, because they're going into the apartment right now.
Absolutely.
This is the crime scene, and you can see... just awful. You can see the mother laying there, you know, after being shot.
Yeah, what you're seeing is an absolute tragedy. What you're seeing is a death from the act of extreme violence, and what you're seeing is now a mom. You know, the sad thing about this is that Sophia, the 6-year-old child, will never know who her mother is, and will always know that, you know, 6 days old, her mother was murdered, and that she was abducted by the murderer and taken away. I mean, think about the impact that's going to have on this child's life, and think about the impact it's having on everybody in that family, including
And you're
the father.
seeing the footage right now. You saw the victim, Laura Abarca, sitting there, and now it's just so heartbreaking. You see this officer going into the bedroom, right? They're searching, looking around. And there is the crib, right? That is where that 6-day-old little baby was. Like you said, it actually really does pull at your heartstrings seeing this video, even more so than pictures, because you kind of get this kind of firsthand guttural reaction to what it must have been like to see this crime scene firsthand.
Yes, and also, too, I want to add one more point to this, and that is the total silence. You know, these cameras are worn by police officers. What you have is the total silence. And you're watching and seeing the video, and you're seeing this person who's dead, and you're seeing all the crime scene as the police are actually seeing it online. And then the trial goes on, and now what do you think the jury's doing? They're looking straight at Yesenia. So as they're watching these very disturbing videos, and they're watching these very disturbing images that are so graphic and so hard to look at, and they're required to look at them, and they're required to consider all this information, and then they're told now to turn back, and what are they doing? They're looking at Yesenia. Think how hard it is at that point for her defense attorney to try to put up any kind of a defense. This is a very, very tough case for her lawyer. Very hard case.
Yeah, I mean, there's the pros and cons of these videos, and I mean, in a case like this, I do think obviously it becomes a little hard then for that defense attorney to put on a case, but at the same time, this is what happened. So it's just giving, perhaps, you could argue as a prosecutor, an accurate portrayal of what happened on that day and what was found at the murder scene.
Yeah, we call this evidence compelling.
Absolutely, Gary. Okay, stand by with me for a few more minutes. I want to turn now briefly to some testimony we heard this morning from Guadalupe Nogada. She is the victim's mother. She's Laura Abarca's mother. And she testified because you have to remember the defendant in this case actually knew the victim. I don't know if we call them close friends, but they had worked together a couple years back. They knew each other, and the victim, and the defendant seemed to have a very keen interest when Laura Abarca had this baby, was checking up on her, wanted to see how she was doing. So let's take a listen to some of the victim's mother's testimony on the stand. Okay, we are just inside a courtroom in Wichita, Kansas, listening to testimony of the victim's mother in the case of Yesenia Sesmas, who's on trial for the murder and abduction of a little 6-day-old baby that was, according to prosecutors, taken from a woman by the name of Laura Abarca's apartment and taken to Texas, where investigators then found her. I'm here alongside Gary Gerstenfield, and we were just listening to the victim's mother through a translator, which often happens if the person doesn't speak English. So the jurors were listening to her statements through a translator, which, you know, kind of does change the tone a little bit because you have a person translating to the jurors what is being said. Gary, are you there?
I am. Good to be with Rachel.
I mean, the fact that she had a translator, does that change the substance or how the jurors may interpret her testimony when they're not hearing it, I guess, directly if they can't understand Spanish?
Oh, sure. I mean, the joke is there's always something lost in the translation. What you don't get is the intimacy and the immediacy of live witness testimony, because obviously you're gauging the words that are being said really through the interpreter, and the interpreter is not supposed to show any emotion when they give when they provide their information. Again, they're not providing testimony; they are simply interpreting, not translating, but interpreting what's being said. And there's a big difference between that. When a witness gives evidence or testimony, normally it's done in English. But when they don't speak English and it goes through an interpreter, the words that might be used, for example, in Spanish, maybe in slang, and so you have to translate that into a similar slang word in English, and that's why we use the term interpreter as opposed to simply using a translator like Google Translator. So there is something that is lost. However, in this particular case, what are we trying to get from Guadalupe? What we're trying to get is a connection between the victim and the killer, and she's able to establish that because she saw the two of them together. That's really what her point is for being on the stand and the testimony she's giving, and for that part, she's been very successful.
She saw them together before the alleged murder and kidnapping, and she refers specifically to a conversation where Yesenia said that she was thinking about moving into this apartment building. Okay, that's a little bit strange, right? Like, was she really trying to move into this apartment building? Was she trying to find out details, Gary, of what it was like to live there, the security apparatus, that sort of thing? We'll see. Let's take a quick break. We're going to go to more of her testimony where we get into some of that important stuff right after the break. Okay, very interesting testimony from the mother of the victim in the Yesenia Sesmas trial that we're following out of Wichita. She's accused of first-degree murder and also the kidnapping. Investigators believe she killed a mother, then took her 6-day-old baby and fled the state of Kansas, went to Texas, and was ultimately going to go to Mexico with this baby. It's a really kind of crazy story. But we were getting some really kind of critical testimony. This is the victim's mother, and two things, Gary Gerstenfield, who's my guest for this afternoon, that I took from this testimony. One, she was asking specifically the victim about the security footage, or not the security footage, the security of the apartment building. That's a little odd. This was a conversation that happened the day before the murder. And then she also seemed to take note of the grandmother of the baby, or the mother of the victim, not going to work the next day, and specifically saying, oh, I'll stop by the following day, which is when the murder happened. What do you make of this testimony, Gary?
Well, again, what the prosecutor's trying to do is establish that this is not a, well, we're trying to establish, first of all, this is a first-degree murder case. And the first-degree murder is where there's premeditation. And so what the prosecutor wants to show through this witness's, Guadalupe's testimony, is that there was careful planning going into this, and this was not something that was an emotional moment where, you know, a murder happened, but it was done without a whole lot of thought. Maybe it was passion or something like that. And that's mainly the difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder.
Yeah, because that is real. We don't really know what the defense is yet in this case, because we had, as we mentioned earlier, we had the defense attorney give his opening statement, and it was bizarre, Gary, in my opinion, because he really made no. I don't know. Did you listen to it? I don't know if you got a chance to listen to it, but it was like 4 minutes long. You can listen to it on our YouTube page. We have all of this archived. It was 4 minutes long, and he doesn't really bring up the relevant facts of the case. He simply gives the jurors a description of what first-degree murder means. You know, that you have to come with the intent to murder someone, and then it almost sounds like a law school lecture where the professor should probably get an F because it's so not engaging and not applying to the facts of the case. What did you make of that? Because you now are bringing up this issue of first-degree murder. She's facing those charges, but it seemed to me maybe the defense was trying to go down the route of, yeah, she did it, yeah, it was her, but it wasn't intentional. It was just something that happened all of a sudden, right? I don't know.
Well, sometimes you have a case where, you know, you're hoping for hope, you're hoping for prayer, and you know you probably don't have either. So I would want to check the styrofoam cup next to that defense attorney and see if that ice water, in fact, isn't vodka.
Oh,
I know that's what I would probably be wanting to drink if I was sitting next to that, if I was sitting as the defense counsel in this case. You brought up a very good point, though, Rachel, which is worth going into, and that is first-degree murder and second-degree murder. What's the difference? And there's a real good illustration, I think, that your viewers and listeners can follow. Think of first-degree murder and second-degree murder, think of murder as like a chocolate chip cookie, okay? And like any good chocolate chip cookie, you're going to have chocolate chips in it. And we'll think of the chocolate chip as premeditation. Premeditation means that I intend to end your life. I intend to kill you. And so if you're a prosecutor, what you're trying to show is the chocolate chip as part of that chocolate chip cookie. And if you're a defense attorney, you're trying to slice and cut that cookie up in such a way as you don't have any chocolate chip. Unfortunately, in this case, for Yesenia, it's a Hershey kiss.
Gary, I have to tell you, I want to congratulate you because you are the first guest that has ever come on the Law and Crime Network and compared murder to a chocolate chip cookie. I don't know what to make of this, Gary. Okay, we're going to continue our review of some of the testimony from this morning in the Yesenia Sesmas case that we're following out of Wichita, Kansas. She's on trial for first-degree murder and kidnapping, killing the mother, kidnapping that 6-day-old baby. The victim's mother took the stand. We listened to some of that critical testimony before we started chatting. Let's listen to some more. Okay, so just to give you some context on this testimony, the victim's mother is testifying, and she's talking about how the family was preparing for this baby to come, and that there you can see the picture there. That's the victim and the father and the beautiful little girl, Sophia. And the family was preparing for this baby to come. A girlfriend had thrown Laura Abarca, shown there in the photo, a showering her with gifts. And Gary Gerstenfield, who's on the line with me, I assume, of course, where the prosecution is going with this is to say, if this woman really wanted to give her baby away like Yesenia is claiming, why would she buy diapers? Why would she have a shower? These aren't things someone does when they're giving their child away, either up for adoption or to a friend, right?
Have a case of murder and you're the defense counsel, you're trying to come up with something. And, you know, hope and prayer, and as I said, there's not much hope in this case and there's not much prayer for the defense. And so really what I think the state is doing at this point is just sort of running up the score. They've moved the ball along pretty well. They've been able to identify, for example, eyewitness testimony, putting the killer along with the victim, which is one of the things that you have to do. And they've established that through the telephone, which is an amazing technical piece of evidence that they're able to bring in that connects the abduction and the kidnapping. So they're able to produce all that together. And the argument that this was somehow an unwanted child or a child that the mother didn't want to keep is really just pulling at strings in the hope that somehow something's going to break loose and somehow they'll be able to pull some kind of a win out of a case where, again, it's really stacked against the defense in this case. And
I want us to continue a little bit more with the victim's testimony, but one point that was made this morning from the medical examiner was we heard testimony of where she was shot and that how it appeared that the gun was literally pressed up to her forehead when she was shot, when prosecutors say Yesenia shot Laura Abarca in the apartment on that day. Couldn't that be in itself evidence of premeditation? Because if she's trying to say they got into some kind of argument and she shot her, to come up to someone, go across the room and stick a gun in their face and put it up against their forehead, I mean, could you just use that action in itself, that evidence from the medical examiner in itself to prove the case?
Absolutely. Again, going back to my metaphor, the chocolate chip.
Oh, no, not the cookie, Gary. Don't do it to me.
So, okay, what is premeditation? Premeditation is the intent to kill somebody. It does not require a lot of thought prior to actually committing the murder. Homicide that of the first degree variety does not require much time or thought in the process of committing the murder. It's simply that somebody specifically intended to end somebody else's life. That is murder in the first degree. So yeah, taking the gun, putting to the forehead and firing the gun and killing the person would in and of itself be pretty good evidence of first-degree murder. Coming to the house earlier and asking about security footage, security cameras, and asking when potential witnesses might not be around, all of that adds to the flavor of premeditation. So all that collectively is just examples of moving the ball along towards what I believe inevitably will be a first-degree murder conviction.
Well, we'll certainly see. This case did go to trial. It didn't have to. It was the decision to go to trial. We're going to continue listening, Gary, to some more of the victim's mother's testimony when we come back after the break. But it's this part, you should stick around with us because this part's really important. She talks about something that the victim did in the days leading up to the murder that are pretty crucial. Let's take a quick break and we'll be back. Welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. Special hello to our Sirius XM listeners. A lot going on today, and we're covering several trials, including we'll take you live just as soon as we can back to the one in Wichita, Kansas, that I know you all have been following. But first, I want to give you a quick update on the case of two former district attorneys who are accused of stealing taxpayer money. It was supposed to go to trial earlier this week, this case in North Carolina. However, it looks like it's going to be postponed for a couple of days. We're covering that case. Take a listen to a summary of what to expect.
The trial of a former district attorney accused of conspiring with another prosecutor to hire his wife for a no-show job is set to begin this week in North Carolina. Wallace Bradshear faces felony charges in connection with the scheme he concocted with former Rockingham County District Attorney Craig Blitzer to hire each other's wives and allow Blitzer's wife, Cindy, to receive $48,000 in unearned state income. Authorities began investigating the work arrangement of the wives after receiving a tip from a staffer in Bradshear's office claiming Cindy was being paid for work she didn't perform. Both men resigned, and Blitzer accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Bradshear. Bradshear has unsuccessfully tried to have the charges dropped, the judge removed from the case, and a gag order enforced against prosecutors. He is also representing himself. If convicted, Bradshear could face more than 18 years in prison. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
Trial to start later this week, or probably more likely into next, but we're keeping a very close eye on that. I'm here alongside Gary Gerstenfield, and he's a criminal defense attorney. One quick note about this case: Bradshear, who is the former district attorney, Gary, said that he plans to defend himself in this case. I find it kind of amusing that he would do that, because I think any good prosecutor would say, even if you're an attorney, you should probably still have someone represent you.
It's very, very difficult to represent yourself, because so much of the job of a defense attorney is in cross-examining a witness, and you really need to have distance, and you need to be able to be somewhat neutral. There's an aspect of cross-examination, which is you have to be able to listen to the testimony of a witness and be able to react instantly, particularly when that testimony is different than what was expected. And if you're personally involved in the case and you're emotionally wrapped up in it, it's very, very difficult for you to do that. Also, juries, strangely enough, they don't like people representing themselves. They really do want to hear from an attorney, and they do want they do want to see sort of a balanced interplay between prosecutor, defense attorney, and the witnesses, including the defendant. But everybody has a role to play, and when you start combining those roles, it really does come for an awkward trial.
Well, we'll certainly keep an eye on this one. When it starts, we do plan to stream it here on the Law and Crime Network, so keep an eye on that. For now, I want to turn back to another case that we have been following all morning long, and that's the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita, Kansas. That woman who is facing murder and kidnapping charges for allegedly murdering a mom and stealing her 6-day-old baby girl, Sophia, taking her out of Kansas, escaping to Texas, where she's found by investigators, and then kind of admitting to the whole thing, but saying that it wasn't supposed to end up this way, that in fact Laura Abarca, who's the victim in this case, had promised the baby to her. Now, so far, as the prosecutor pointed out in the openings, we haven't seen any evidence that Laura Abarca, the victim in this case, wanted to give this baby to Yesenia. And the mom, we've been listening to her testimony, the victim's mom, And she makes it pretty clear, Gary, that, you know, they had planned to have this baby here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This, again, I keep joking about the hope and the prayer that you have as a defense attorney. One of the questions I think that your listeners and the people watching on television are probably wondering is, why would you take a case with such difficult hurdles as a defense attorney? Why would you take a case like this to trial where the evidence is so stacked against you? And the answer is for two reasons. The first is that, well, you never know. Something could break loose and you might pull a win out of what looks like a hopeless case. But there's a second reason, and this is something that's very important for the prosecutor, particularly when they have such a strong case with such strong evidence, and that is, don't be too sure of yourself and don't be overconfident. There's been a lot of cases which have been reversed on error. And error is something that the prosecutor's always got to be concerned about. So if the judge, for example, allows evidence to come into the case and heard before the jury that shouldn't have been, if there are mistakes made during the trial, well, that could result in a new trial, and then the government has to start all over again. And sometimes getting all these witnesses back sometimes is difficult to do. I've seen a number of cases where
And Gary, and we were listening, kind of reviewing some of what happened this morning. And before we went to break, I said we were going to listen to some really critical testimony from the victim's mother. We heard some important stuff about how the defendant had asked about the security of the apartment building and was basically seeing if there was going to be a witness who was going to be away. She wanted to make sure this mother was alone. But here's something, and we'll take a listen to her testimony that's pretty critical as well, proving that this mom wanted to hold on to her baby and had no intentions of giving it away. Let's take a listen.
Yes, sir.
And the victim's mother, Gary, getting a little emotional on the stand there as she's talking about her daughter and her daughter's love for this child and how she had all these presents and how excited she was and how she was planning to breastfeed the child and had taken out a life insurance policy for this child. To me, you know, that specifically really was a kind of critical piece of information. Why would you take out a life insurance policy on someone that you were planning to give away?
Rachel, absolutely. In fact, Guadalupe, the mother of the victim's testimony, I think this is probably her most compelling moment, which is establishing the love between mother and daughter and the desire to keep this child. And that completely blows out the water any argument that this child was given away or that this child was unwanted. There's just no evidence whatsoever of that. As a matter of fact, this evidence is so compelling that, you know, the jury's going to be, I think, very, very much persuaded that this was a very much wanted and loved child.
Okay, now, Gary, if you don't mind sticking with us for a few more minutes before we let you go, I want to turn now to more of the victim's mother's testimony, because I do think it was pretty important, and I think it came across pretty well even through that translator of what she had to say. She seemed genuine. She seemed emotional. She talked specifically about the truck that the defendant was driving. Of course, if you're just joining us, this is the Yesenia Sesmas trial out of Wichita, Kansas. She's a woman accused of murdering and kidnapping a little baby, accused of murdering the mother and kidnapping that 6-day-old baby from the mother's house. This is the victim's mother on the stand describing the defendant's truck and how that plays all into this case. Let's take a quick listen. And you're listening to testimony from the Yesenia Sesmas case out of Wichita, Kansas. We're going to take you back live in there. Lunch was supposed to be about an hour and 20 minutes. It's 1:54 here on the East Coast, 12:54 in Kansas. So I'd expect we will take you back live in that case in about 20 minutes. Again, if you're just joining us, especially for our Sirius XM listeners, this woman's on trial for murdering a mother, then taking her 6-day-old baby, escaping to Texas where she is caught. I'm here with Gary Gerstenfield, who's a criminal defense attorney, been listening to some of the victim's mother's very compelling testimony. She was there not only, obviously, for some of the emotion, but she also established some pretty important details, specifically about how Yesenia acted on the day before of this alleged murder. What does that tell you about her state of mind, Gary?
Well, what we're seeing is, again, we're talking about what is premeditation, and we're trying to establish that this murder was more than just a passion moment, but rather this was something that was planned, cold, and calculated. And so Guadalupe, the mother of the victim, what she's able to establish is that there was planning going back prior to even the day of the murder. And again, that helps establish the first-degree murder component that's required in order to get the conviction that the prosecutor is seeking.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of an important part of this case that I found very interesting, and that is how, of course, when detectives arrived to this scene in Wichita, Kansas, and we showed some of that horrifying video earlier, they were looking for a 6-day-old baby. You know, that was really a mission. They knew this woman was dead, but their first priority is, okay, this child, we need to locate this child. And they found a cell phone, Laura Barca, the victim's cell phone. And that actually helped lead investigators to track down Yesenia. And, you know, part of me is just thinking, you know, if this was some kind of big plot, why she used WhatsApp, which is a text messaging app, why would she leave such blatant communication between the two of them for police to find? You would have thought she would have been a little smarter about this, but again, you know.
Covering her trail. Yeah, so imagine, I suspect that leaving the cell phone was a mistake. Clearly, it is powerful.
Sorry, it was Laura Barca's cell phone, not her cell phone. But with that cell phone, they found communication between Laura and Yesenia. That was
so I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, without question, I think that the plan probably was to take the cell phone. People know that cell phones contain information that can connect the dots. And so I think that she probably would have thought to take the cell phone with her. I think that, you know, there's a shooting, it makes a lot of noise, so she has to move quickly. And I think she really did leave the phone there by accident. Strangely enough, even if the cell phone had been removed and the police didn't actually physically have the cell phone there, the fact of the matter is the WhatsApp app, that information contained there is contained by the app itself. And so you can recreate that information. You don't actually need the cell phone itself to get that information.
And just to kind of give you a picture of the scene, when she was caught in Texas shortly after this, she actually talked to investigators. Sesmas did, the defendant in this case. And she described how she took, and you know how small babies are when they're first born. This baby, and we have a picture of the victim, I believe, somewhere. This baby was 6 days old, and she, according to there the baby is, you can kind of get a sense of how small she is. She took the baby and put the baby, after she had shot the mother, according to this arrest affidavit in which she spoke to investigators, she put the baby in a diaper bag, like in the bag. And I guess to conceal while she was running to her car from neighbors that she was taking a child.
Right. And that goes to the point about the urgency. Oh, look, the more information that is gleaned in this trial, the more information that comes to light, the more horrific the case gets. I mean, this is one of those cases which just, you know, it is absolutely, there's nothing in it that is not terrifying. The beautiful young mom shot, killed, her baby abducted, taken out of state, the child to grow up without having her own mom, the violence of the death, the suddenness of the death, and the sadness and reckless and senselessness of this crime. It just goes to show you, I guess, really how horrific some people can be.
It certainly is, Gary. We have to take a quick break. And Gary, I want to thank you for joining us here on the Law and Crime Network. As always, one of our regulars. We enjoy having you here. When we come back in just a few minutes, we're going to take you inside the defense's case. We get a little glimpse through opening statements, and we're going to play some of those when we get back.